Once upon a time, in the peaceful town of Maplewood, Daniel was a bright 12 years old boy who loved books, school, and his parents. His father worked as a businessman, always traveling for work, and his mother was a lawyer, often busy with her cases. Despite their busy lives, they loved Daniel dearly and ensured he had everything he needed. One summer, his parents decided to take a long business trip together, leaving Daniel in the care of their trusted housekeeper, Mrs. Alva. She had worked for them for years, a quiet woman in her mid-50s, always polite but distant. She was known for her impeccable work and reliability, and the family trusted her without question. Before his parents left, they sat Daniel down. "We will be gone for a few weeks," his mother said, "but you are in good hands with Mrs. Alva. Listen to her and behave yourself." Daniel nodded, not too worried. Mrs. Alva had always been kind to him, and he figured it would be just like any other time she looked after him. But as soon as his parents left, something about Mrs. Alva began to change. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. Mrs. Alva cooked meal, cleaned the house, and occasionally checked on Daniel while he studied. However, by the end of the week, Daniel began to notice strange things. Mrs. Alva would disappear for a long period, and at night, he could hear her muttering strange words from her room, words in a language he didn't recognize. Once, when he passed her door, he noticed a faint flickering light beneath it, as if she were burning candles late into the night. One evening, after a particularly odd dinner, where Mrs. Alva seemed to be watching him more closely than usual, she asked Daniel to come sit with her in the living room. The room was dimly lit, the curtain drawn tight, and the air felt unusually thick. "I have watched you grow up, Daniel," she said, her voice low and unsettling. "You've always been special, more special than your parents know." Daniel, confused, looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You've been chosen," she said, leaning forward. "There are forces in the world that most people can't see, can't understand, but you are destined for something greater, and tonight you will begin your journey." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Johnny? What are you talking about?" Without another word, Mrs. Alva stood up and motioned for him to follow her. She led him down the hall to the basement, a place Daniel rarely went. It was dark, the air musty and damp. As they descended the stairs, Daniel's unease grew. He noticed strange symbols drawn in chalk on the walls, and the flicker of candlelight illuminated a circle of dark symbols etched into the floor. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. It was covered in old, worn clothes, with symbols carved into its surface. Around the altar were candles that flickered with an unnatural, airy glow. Mrs. Alva turned to Daniel, her face no longer warm but cold, and calculating. "Tonight you will be initiated into a sacred circle. You will gain power, knowledge, and strength beyond your wildest dream. But you must do as I say." Daniel's heart raced. He wanted to run, to scream, but something about Mrs. Alva's voice, her presence, seemed to hold him in place. She handed him a small, twisted dagger, its blade cold and sharp. "This is your initiation," she said, her voice almost hypnotic. "Cut your hand and let the blood fall onto the altar. This will seal your bond with the force that awaits you." Terrified, Daniel hesitated. "I don't want to do this," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You have no choice," Mrs. Alva replied, sharply, her eyes darkening. "You were chosen long before you were born. This is your destiny." Before Daniel could react, Mrs. Alva began to chant in the strange language he had heard her muttering at night. The candle flickered violently, and the shadow in the room seemed to shift and move, as though they were alive. An unnatural wind swept through the basement, and Daniel felt a heavy presence settle around him. Without fully understanding why, Daniel raised the dagger and, trembling, did as she commanded. The moment his blood touched the altar, the room seemed to tremble. The shadow around them swirled, and the air was filled with whispers. Dark, sinister voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Mrs. Alva smiled, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "It is done," she said. "You are now one of us." From that night, Daniel was different. Something dark had taken hold of him. His once bright eyes were now cold, his behavior more distant and strange. At night, he would have vivid dreams, filled with figure and dark ritual. Dreams that felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. He began to withdraw from his friends, spending hours alone in his room, drawing strange symbols and murmuring the chants Mrs. Alva had taught him. He no longer feared the dark. Instead, he felt an odd connection to it, as though it were a part of him. When his parents returned from their trip, they immediately sensed something was wrong. Daniel barely greeted them and spent most of his time locked in his room. His mother noticed the symbol he had drawn on his wall, the strange books hidden under his bed, and the way his once loving demeanor had turned cold and unrecognizable. Worried, his mother confided in their pastor, Reverend Thomas. "He is not the same," she told him. "Something is wrong. It's like he's become someone else." Reverend Thomas, a man known for his deep faith and sensitivity to spiritual matters, agreed to visit the house. When he arrived, he immediately felt the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to Daniel. He saw the dark symbol, the strange drawings, and the way Daniel's eye darted nervously around the room. "May I speak with him?" Reverend Thomas asked gently. Daniel's parents led him to their son, where they found him sitting on the floor, drawing yet another dark symbol in chalk. The moment Reverend Thomas stepped into the room, Daniel recoiled, his eyes flashing with something dark and unnatural. "Leave me alone," Daniel growled, his voice low and distorted. Reverend Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward and began to pray, holding his Bible in one hand and reaching out to place his other hand on Daniel's shoulder. The reaction was immediate. Daniel screamed, a guttural, terrifying sound, and his body convulsed, as if something inside him was fighting to break free. The lights in the room flickered, and a cold wind seemed to rush through the house. For hours, Reverend Thomas prayed over Daniel, casting out the dark presence that had taken hold of him. Mrs. Alva was nowhere to be found, having disappeared the moment Reverend Thomas arrived. As the prayer continued, Daniel's screams turned into sobs, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded him slowly began to lift. Finally, as dawn broke, Daniel collapsed into Reverend Thomas' arms. Exhausted but free, the dark presence that had controlled him was gone. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his normal self. Though he could barely remember the events of the initiation, his parents, shaken by the experience, fired Mrs. Alva, who had vanished from town, leaving no trace behind. They never spoke of what had happened, grateful that their son had been delivered from the dark force that had nearly consumed him. Though Daniel was free, he was left with lingering memories of the dark ritual, the whispered voice, and the sinister presence that had once filled his dream. But he knew deep that as long as he stayed close to his family and faith, the darkness would never claim him again. Years had passed since the traumatic events of Daniel's initiation. Daniel, now a teenager, had slowly rebuilt his life. He excelled in school and with the guidance of Reverend Thomas and the support of his parents, he had learned to keep the darkness at bay. He never forgot what had happened, but with time, the shadow of his past had become distant memories, until the day he heard a name he thought he would never hear again. Please follow for part 2.